Hello, my name is Daniel Salas Sanchez, and I chose corn ethanol for my biofuel project. Ethanol is a form of alcohol that is derived from many forms of plant biomass. This alcohol is then blended with gasoline in order to increase the amount of octane present and reduce the carbon monoxide. There are multiple forms of ethanol that are widely used. The most commonly used blend would be that of E10, which is composed of 10% ethanol and 90% gasoline, and is approved for most general gasoline-powered vehicles. Certain vehicles are designed for the specific performance under ethanol fuel, and these are called flexible fuel vehicles, allowing for gasoline ethanol that contains 51% to 83% ethanol. And around 97% of gasoline in the U.S. contains at least some ethanol. The most widely used forms of biomass when considering ethanol would include starch or sugar-based biomass and cellulosic biomass. The starch-based biomass takes a considerably less amount of time than with the cellulosic biomass. The U.S. focuses on using starch-based crops by the dry or wet milling process. The major starch-based crop that is widely used in the U.S. is corn, for its mass ability to produce fast ethanol through biological and chemical processes. On the other hand, cellulosic production can include anything from grass, wood, and crop residue from agricultural industry that can be further processed into ethanol. Cellulosic production involves more steps because the sugar needs to be collected from the feedstock first, rather than the sugar being the base of the crops, and then yield ethanol. Around 90% of all ethanol production in the U.S. is the dry mill production process, which begins with collecting large amounts of starch-based crops. In the U.S., corn is the most commonly used of the starch crops. Corn is grounded down into flour in order to expose the starch matter in the kernel. This dried flour is then mixed with water to create a mixture called mash. The pH is adjusted, and the mash gets heated at a certain temperature to allow for the enzyme alpha amylase to convert the cornstarch into complex sugars. More heat is then added to this mash to kill unwanted bacteria. The mash can now be fermented by adding glucoamylase to break down the complex sugars into dextrose, and then yeast is added to consume the dextrose. This can take up to 40 to 80 hours. Within the fermentation process, CO2 is released and the sugars proceed to get converted into ethanol. The liquid that remains is called beer and contains around 17% to 18% ethanol by volume. Distillation occurs with this beer by heating up the liquid and allowing for ethanol vapors to separate and rise to the top of the distillation column, flowing into the next column. This liquid that remains is called pulse tillage and can be turned into valuable co-products for more profit. The second column containing the ethanol gas is then further heated to concentrate 95% ethanol, which is then released into a third column, which is called a condenser that turns the vapor back into the liquid form. This ethanol is put through a molecular sieve in order to clear out remaining water, producing the final production of about 99% ethanol, and transferred to storage and transportation tanks for use. This ethanol is then mixed with certain percentages of gasoline for specific use and can be used as biofuel. This form of biofuel is a widely available and commonly used form of fuel that the U.S. has used for a while now. Ethanol was first used to power an engine as a form of biofuel way back in 1826. The ethanol industry and way of living in the modern world began in the 1970s as petroleum-based fuel increased in price. Corn became the predominant feedstock because of its grand ability to yield large amounts of ethanol alcohol compared to other crops. Within the 50 years of development, the ethanol industry has strived to become more efficient and green, while still being a key player in the biofuel industry compared to other biofuels. The simplicity of using biological fermentation in a mass and calculated amount has created a boom in usage. While corn ethanol is a helpful form of biofuel when compared to gasoline alone in reducing the carbon emission, a DOE study published by Argonne National Laboratory in 2021 revealed that U.S. corn ethanol has 44 to 52% lower greenhouse gas emissions than gasoline. This only has been achieved with time and change, finding that between 2005 and 2019, U.S. corn ethanol carbon emission have decreased 20% due to increased corn yield, decreased fertilizer usage, and improved production techniques. Corn ethanol has more potential to reduce the carbon footprint to around 40% now to a drastic 70% lower greenhouse gas emissions. The CO2 released by fermentation can be used for the biomass crops to repeat a cycle. This shows that with the right practices and technology, net negative carbon emissions can be possible through capturing CO2 during fermentation and using it efficiently rather than releasing it into the atmosphere. Because of corn ethanol's widespread usage and significant impact on the nation's fuel, it is a thriving industry with more economic potential. Every year, around 30% of field corn goes into the production of fuel ethanol. Corn ethanol production has allowed for a diverse set of industry and production in the U.S., relying on rural communities where corn is cultivated, transportation and storage control, and creating many industrial and domestic jobs. In 2019, the ethanol industry created around 349,000 jobs for Americans and contributed to more than $43 billion in GDP and added $23.3 billion to household incomes, further generating $10 billion in tax revenues for government usage. Ethanol has a long history in the U.S., and its impact is clear. More than 98% of U.S. gasoline contains ethanol, which is a clear permanent use of the biofuel. However, the COVID-19 pandemic had a significant impact in almost every U.S. industry, and the corn ethanol industry was not immune. During the pandemic, many ethanol plants shut down or reduced capacity and had significant decrease in production of not only ethanol, but also CO2 and co-products that are crucial to the corn ethanol industry. The U.S. heavily relied on the ethanol industry in many forms, and the pandemic completely decreased the ability for production and usage. Earlier this year, however, the USDA provided $700 million to restore the sustainable fuel market that was hit by the pandemic, and this includes the ethanol industry. As the pandemic overall decreases and life returns to how it was before, the awareness and usage of ethanol will naturally increase as well, especially with federal aid. Ethanol is a highly important form of biofuel that's widely used nationwide. It has an overall lower greenhouse gas emission rate when compared to petroleum, and has every potential of becoming not only net zero carbon emission, but even net negative carbon emissions. The production of corn ethanol creates many other byproducts that are essential for the industry and the consumer market, which relies on such products such as CO2. It plays a significant role in the fuel economy, creating much economic potential for the nation. The corn ethanol industry should get help getting back on its feet from the COVID-19 pandemic, and when it does, should strive for decreasing the carbon footprint with existing technology. As ethanol is already highly used, I think the main course of action for the biofuel industry is to seek all potentials of lowering and decreasing carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. Ethanol releases CO2 when used in vehicle consumption and is released into the atmosphere, but this is offset by the amount of CO2 produced during the production of ethanol. The fermentation process releases CO2 alongside ethanol, and at times this CO2 is released as emissions. But if every plant were to collect CO2 for further profit, this would widely reduce production emissions. Existing technology to capture CO2 can help reduce the harm within the ethanol industry. Overall, ethanol production and usage is still a better and more renewable source of energy than petroleum, but can be better with better production abilities. Here are my sources, and thank you very much for listening.